So, I mean, I do believe everybody is secretly a communist, and people are angry, and they should be angry. They're just aiming their anger at the wrong thing. Fatalistic cynicism is a privilege, but I think it's really easy to see that the impossible happens all the time. Like, our reality today is so different than anybody could have imagined.
Welcome to the Social iPod, where sociologists
Winona
and Michelle
talk with a variety of guests to expose complex relationships between the personal and the political.
use sociology to explore big ideas.
and explore the taken for granted in everyday life, breaking down the complexity of institutionalized issues and inequality through lived experiences. And today we are joined by my undergraduate mentor, Dr. Arthur Scarritt. Welcome to our sociology podcast.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited.
Having earned his bachelor's degree at the Evergreen State College and his PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Arthur Scarritt is a professor in the Department of Sociology at Boise State University, where he served as chair for 6 years. Scarritt serves as co-director of the Intermountain Social Research Lab, also known as INSERL, through which he has trained countless undergraduate students in the ways of social research and critical thought with a focus on neoliberal higher education. In 2024, he co-founded the Syringa State Community Research Lab, which maybe you're calling SRSL? Maybe it doesn't have.
It's Squirrel.
A squirrel. Good. That's good. Which employs INSERL-trained students to conduct contracted work with local organizations. His studies have focused on how people challenge and reproduce the multiple forms of inequality that make up their daily lives. He also researches and has published on topics of political ideology, racial inequality, and white supremacy. So in prepping our questions for you, Scarritt, and this is going to come weird because I still can't call you Arthur, so it's going to be Scarritt for me. But in prepping our questions for you, I found myself curious about how you became interested in studying inequalities and neoliberalism, being one of the first formal teachers for me when it came to inequalities and neoliberalism. So that's our first question, but a little bonus question too here is, how would you describe neoliberalism to someone who is just first hearing about the concept?
Yeah, I'll do the first part first there. I think it was really I'm old enough that I was aware and around when Reagan was elected, and his spin on the homeless being urban campers and ketchup being a vegetable, and just this unbound, classist, regressive, cruel set of policies coming out. I think that was a big element, and I was, I'm kind of a faculty brat too, so my dad did research in other countries. He was an Africanist, and just seeing how the structural adjustment programs were just stealing money from poor people and giving it to the rich. Even back then, it was crazy. And as a young impressionable kid, just seeing the impact of U.S. imperialism straight out, and U.S. citizens having no clue as to the impact the United States had on the rest of the world, really got me motivated in that, and just the pointlessness of a lot of the inhumanity and inequality that unfortunately has only gotten more and more robust. So the second part, describing neoliberalism, neoliberalism is sort of this utopian fantasy, the idea of seamless markets enabling everybody to enjoy this gobs and gobs of freedom, that we can interact freely with one another and get whatever we want. And I think it's funny, in some ways it's kind of sold as, Marx's description of communism, like from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, right?
Not ironic at all.
Right. Well, it's funny because that tests well that Marx's definition of communism. Like, people, oh yeah, that sounds fair, that sounds great. It's like, great, fine.
Right.
So, I mean, I do believe everybody is secretly a communist, and people are angry, and they should be angry. They're just aiming their anger at the wrong thing. David Graeber has this great definition of baseline communism, this idea that, not thinking of communism as public ownership of the means of production, but as from each according to their ability to each according to their need, right? That this is actually the governing principle of everybody's life. Like, hey,
Right.
pass the salt. And
Right.
you have the salt, so you pass the salt. So you had it, you need it. You don't engage in any sort of utility maximization type of formula. Well, what am I going to get out of it, right? It's just like, no, this makes sense. And it makes sense up a lot of layers at the workplace, everywhere else. People are doing this kind of baseline communism. But, then they kind of close it off to outsiders or whatever. But, so anyway, okay. So
Right.
neoliberalism is sold as this fantasy of seamless markets where everybody gets to exchange whatever they want with everybody else, and there's no interference, and everybody gets what they want. And this is a crazy idea to think that markets will somehow function into themselves and perfectly. And so, really what neoliberalism ends up being, David Harvey has a great quote about it. He says, well, in reality it's a set of draconian policies aimed at reasserting elite class power. So really these policies are not about market freedom, and there's this idea of collective growth of the economy. In fact, a lot of neoliberal policy is just transferring resources from the non-wealthy to the wealthy, privatizing the commons, creating brand new ways of privatizing the commons and transferring that to wealthy people. So now things we didn't have to pay for before, now we have to pay more and more and more and more to, and this just goes to super wealthy people. And so they try to set up markets and everything, and this notion that markets are going to work really well and seamlessly is crazy when you engage with healthcare, right? Just like, oh, I had to deal with the bureaucracy of the healthcare provider, the insurance company, and all these people are just taking all this money explicitly for non-healthcare reasons, right? Or even denying me healthcare. I'm paying for them to deny me healthcare. Shows sort of the ridiculousness of it, and all that money is just going to wealthy people. So it's, ends up just being a big transfer of wealth from the poor to the wealthy, but also the non-productive wealthy, right? It's not like they're capitalists who are generating wealth. They're just taking stuff, right? So it's taking rather than making.
I really appreciate that perspective. Michelle, if you don't mind me going off script a little bit, you mentioned this productive versus non-productive capital, and I'm wondering if you would be interested in elaborating a little bit more about what you see as the relationship between capitalism and neoliberalism conceptually, right? I guess, do you see neoliberalism as kind of its own distinct mode of production, as maybe some critics, or even from the right, would argue that neoliberalism is distinct from their ideal form of capitalism? Or do you see neoliberalism as a form of capitalism, or a secret third option?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I mean, it's some people call it rentier capitalism, which is kind of a contradiction in terms. The rentier class are basically a bunch of parasites who sit on top of society and just get wealth sent to them because they have the rights to certain things and people pay them to access that, right? So, but this is characterized neoliberalism. So in some ways it's anti-productive and therefore in a kind of ideal typical way anti-capitalistic, in that it is really not investing in enhancing the means of production, but it is creating means for wealthy people to just collect money, right? So even, and part of the scam of it is that it portrays its rent collecting as being productive. But if you look, Donald Trump is a rentier par excellence, right? He gets money just for doing nothing, and
Right.
but he's a product of this whole system in that way, and so maybe it was inevitable that a kind of authoritarian, personalistic cult would percolate to the top in order to salvage this really inherently unfair and unequal system. So, I've actually written on sort of the competition between the rentier elite and the capitalist elite, and really sort of feel like when the capitalists had the upper hand, Marx predicted the rentier would disappear, and then after Marx, Keynes said, predicted what did he say? The euthanasia of the rentier, I think he said, where just, these parasites would stop functioning because capitalism was so effective and compelling. But really, the rentiers made themselves useful to capitalists. And then in the 70s, when worker power was really high and there were talks all over the world of nationalizing all kinds of productive facilities, the capitalists dropped their partnership with labor and joined up with the rentiers, and that's when you got neoliberalism. So I think it's it's a uncomfortable partnership, because neoliberalism is all about speculation and big windfalls of money, and so it put the capitalists under a lot greater discipline. Instead of, capitalists under capitalist rationale is steady long-term growth, and the rentiers want big windfalls immediately. So capitalists were right, and so they monopolized, right? So they created monopolies, and they became rentiers themselves, and that's all these IPOs and all this stuff. It's all just rent collecting. It's not productive.
Right.
That's a really interesting and I think useful distinction for getting into the political economic particulars of this moment we find ourselves in.
It's really hard to communicate. No, it's this rentier parasites that are driving this economy, and that rentier throws people off, and the notion of rent is common, but it's like, yeah, okay, you're paying somebody to use this stuff, and you have to pay them because they own that, but then it's that's on the scale of the whole economy. I find it very challenging to communicate that to people. Really, higher education, right? Higher education in the 70s
Right.
was free, right? Because it's a public good. It's like, guess what? Everybody's better off the more everybody's educated. Like, that's not rocket science here, right? But then Reagan, when he was governor, introduced the notion of tuition, and all of a sudden higher education got transformed into this mechanism of rent collecting for these
Right.
crazy companies. And now they're, with all the student loan money slushing around, they're dividing those in tranches and speculating on those like they did with the housing bubble. So it's, tuition is not for education.
And that relationship to ruling class politics overall is ever present. It reminds me of that leaked memo, I forget who it was in the Reagan administration, that was raising concerns about the United States having too educated of a proletariat, like actually use that language of proletariat, right? And thinking that having that debt as a mechanism of discipline for the working class would be useful going forward.
Yeah.
At averting what they saw as kind of a bubbling, class politics crisis.
And I mean, it was really probably the brown and black people who really got them behind that too. I mean, it was very class based, but then, all these people who are not white, all these people of color are like, this is not my history.
Yeah.
These are not my people. If I'm going to learn, I want to learn about me. And so then you got a big, flourishing of ethnic studies, queer studies, gender studies coming up, and hey, we can use higher education to really empower us. And oh God, they didn't want that.
yeah, cannot underestimate the role of racism here either, right? Or the gains of the many movements and what they won in the 60s, 70s, so on, and this reactionary backlash to it.
You already mentioned a couple of scholars that have influenced your work. Can you talk more about, you have this influence of your home and experience from what you observed and experienced, but who are the scholars and the intellectuals who have informed your perspective, your work, that you always cite? Can you talk more about who grounds your work?
Yeah, I can. I saw that you were going to ask me this question. I'm like, oh my God, it's a bunch of dudes, and it's a lot of white dudes too, which is kind of embarrassing. But I'm gonna lean into that, as some people say, a little bit. I mean, David Harvey, who's a political geographer, British guy who writes copiously about Marxist stuff and on neoliberalism. Dave Graeber, who died way too young, is an anarchist who's just has a lot of really brilliant thinking. So he's got several highly influential works. Bullshit Jobs is probably his best known thing, but he's got Debt, The First 5,000 Years, and The Utopia of Rules, which I think is a fantastic book with a crazy title. And actually, the person that Michelle went through IMSORL with, Jeff Cates, has a cultish devotion to David Graeber, and even now has a tattoo of David Graeber's face on his calf, and only cites David Graeber a ton, but he is very smart in that. I was also thinking about this is crazy thing is one person who's been influential in a lot of my thinking on sort of colonialism and racism has been this guy with a name that is well known now, but when I was working with his stuff, it wasn't so known. But his last name is Mamdani.
Yes.
And it's actually Zoran Mamdani's father, who's an Africanist at Columbia. His name is Mahmoud Mamdani. You probably never took a race class from me, Michelle. I don't know, but I did have people read Mamdani in my race class, and he's really sharp about a lot of colonial analysis. And so I took his...
You wrote a Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Forgive me for interrupting.
Yeah. He did this analysis of colonialism in Africa, and I applied that to Latin America for my dissertation and later work. And to me, it's a hugely applicable model. I think he sort of argues against the applicability of his model, but he sort of talks about these different sort of colonial systems existing side by side and being tied together. And to me, that really helps make sense of Palestine. It helps me make sense of so many different things. Sort of, it sets out the terms of the struggle and just why colonialism is such an enduring form and how it has this flexibility and also this genocidal logic to it, right? So, I wrote a paper recently that's sort of asked this question of, why does colonialism kill off the labor it depends on, right? It would seem to be going against its own interests, but a lot of it's just elitism, and that we're witnessing today, right? These elites just thinking they're just inherently better people than we are because they have gazillions of dollars. I honestly think that, what's that psych book that lists all the
DSM.
DSM. I think sort of having more than $50 million should be listed on there as causing psychosis, because they're just detached.
100%.
Yeah, they're detached from reality, and even the heir to Disney is like, yeah, nobody needs more than $50 million. Like, Christ, what are you gonna do with that? And now they're gonna pay Musk $1 trillion. It's like, oh my God, it's crazy.
I hope they just give him enough money so he can take himself to Mars and stuff.
Right.
That would be great.
Yeah, so in my race work, I definitely do stuff. Eduardo Bonilla Silva has been a big influence, sort of his structural analysis of race, and Charles Mills' stuff on the epistemology of ignorance, where, we set up this system of knowing that basically perpetuates white supremacy as normal. And it's so we can be educated, right? We're educated in a particular way. It's not ignorance that perpetuates this, but actually the way we're educated, right? We set up a system of knowledge that is, sort of, ultimately white supremacist. And that gets embedded in institutions and reproduced that way.
I had a question related to that, just talking about white supremacy, and you being, as you noted, like a white man yourself. How do you find yourself working against white supremacy in your daily life? Like, what are the things that you do that? Because I would like to think that you do, and like a lot of times these things happen in like really small gestures, whether it's like a connection with a student or what. So yeah, what does that look like for you?
Okay, well, I have a story, and I can actually, at this point, only talk about it in a limited way, according to the lawyers. So, Idaho got one of these wonderful laws on the books that is literally called Freedom of Inquiry and Higher Education. And in this, they have listed all of these things you cannot do. You cannot talk about certain terms. And, they try to couch this in language where it'll be defendable in law, right? So it'll meet challenges. And so under certain circumstances, you can do this stuff. And to my mind, academic freedom, I researched white supremacy and I published on it. And so therefore I'm an authority on it, so I can address it. So I'm actually I don't know if it's official, but I am the director of our anti-racism collective through the sociology department. And Boise State took down our website without telling us, which is just...
Wow! Blatant.
Yeah, they said, oh, we had to make sure the whole website conformed to this new law, and we thought that didn't conform to the new law. So when they implemented this new law, and there's all these disclaimers now that when students log into their computer in their classes, there's this disclaimer that's based on this law, and they're like, what is this? What's going on? So as director of the Anti-Racism Collective, I was like, oh, let's put on a panel, and let's call it Fascism, White Supremacy, and the New Idaho Freedom of Inquiry Law.
Get them.
Right. So what it is. And so we were all set to do this. We had a bunch of people, and I made the foolish mistake of putting out a calendar announcement for it, and then the mucky mucks above said, oh, hey, they didn't reach out to me. They reached out to my chair. They didn't talk directly to me. And anyway, we ended up not doing it, with the lawyer saying I could not disclose what they told me. So I'm not disclosing that, I think. But they tried to find workarounds for us, so I'll give them that. But to us, it's like, well, this is an 11th hour, plus you're really, really constructing academic freedom in the narrowest way possible. Like, well, if it's clearly you talking about some of your own published work, and everybody there is talking about published work, then that would count. It's like, well, you realize you have to do research and analysis, and you're an expert in this field, and that's all part of academic freedom, and they were not painting it that way. So there was a bold-fronted attempt at addressing at least white supremacy, maybe fighting it. I do find that my job is one of the better places to address it, and with the undergraduate research program that we run, that Michelle went through 2 years and was a mentor for, a lot of people definitely take that issue on and reveal the racism that permeates the university in different ways. And we train students to not challenge that. We train students to see that people saying racist stuff is good data. So at first it's a little horrible, but you get people sitting there and they're like, well, I don't want to sound racist, but, and so then they proceed to just be racist and say horrible things, and so it can be traumatic, these interviews, and there's definitely a lot of emotional heavy lifting and processing that needs to happen afterwards. And I tell students, you need time just to decompress after these things, and you need to take a shower or whatever it is. It's just, so I definitely see that as part of the battle that we're enjoying. And I've gotten a lot of, you talk about my 2019 article about racism on campus, and I've gotten a lot of good feedback from that. A dean from a school in Seattle contacted me and said, oh my gosh, you hit every issue there. That's great. I'm going to make all my faculty read this article. It's nice. It's fantastic. Yeah. That's a nice shot in the arm. I do. So I teach. I try to point out people's racism to them. Before I was chair, when I was teaching more lower division classes, I would teach race classes and start those classes off by saying, "Hey, y'all are racist, right? Y'all know that, and don't shoot the messenger." And then I explain, what that means, and it's funny because in these classes I never get an immediate reaction. I was like, wow, okay. But then later on, students be like, oh, you made me so angry when you called me racist. I was like, well, I'm racist too. My name is Arthur Scarritt. I'm racist, right? We're all recovering racist. It's like, okay, you were born an American, right? What do you do to be an American? You don't do anything. You just go along with the normal running of America. So you're born into a racist system. It's like your everyday existence is about, structured and perpetuating that, and knowing that is half the battle.
It can be a hard lesson for white students to internalize, I think, and come to terms with, and the institutional character of it as well.
And, and intersectionality helps with that so much, just because that, a lot of female students will be like, when they get exposed to the sociological imagination, which always shocks me at how little exposure they have before coming to college, and they're just like, oh, I knew it. I knew it wasn't my fault.
Sure.
And then they sort of can project out, sexuality is a great one for understanding race, right? I mean, just is such great intersectional learning that goes on and that you can apply one to another to understand. Yes, there's separate dynamics, but there is this underlying principle that does guide them all, and that you can understand one to understand the other, and get a lot of real aha moments that way, which is great.
That's a really interesting insight. I think if one is oppressed by the same system, then there may be common threads, at least to the experience, that one can build on. I think that's been true in my experience as well, whether teaching in academia or in movements or what have you. And it can be the grounds for real solidarity too, I think.
Yeah, class is a little more challenging sometimes, but I think the resistant white dudes, then you have to get into a little more complex conversations, but it's like, white privilege is a relative privilege, right? It's, somebody called it a consolation prize, right? It's not about increasing your status, it's about just being slightly better than somebody else, right? So your white privilege, your racial privilege screws you as far as, class goes. And trying to communicate that is a little more challenging, but I think it's hugely important. It's like, oh, I'm oppressed. It's like, yeah, you're oppressed in a class way, but not in a racial way, right? And don't conflate those.
Right.
That's something I actually have had to talk with a few students this semester about is, so I'm teaching social problems, one of the classes I'm teaching this semester, and we got into finally really talking about race and racial inequality, and I had students, white male students especially, in their, I sign journal reflections for each week as they're reading through the materials, and then they can reflect on discussion and stuff too. And in those, I saw a lot of them talking about how they're like, okay, I understand, white privilege, but then they're like, but that, essentially, not that they don't have it, but they're like, but also class, because these students also happen to be they had single parents, or they grew up not being economically disadvantaged in different ways, and so they were having a really hard time just being just focusing on that aspect alone, which, I mean, we can't focus on that aspect alone because intersectionality is a thing. And so the point that I had to make to them essentially was both are true. You do benefit from white privilege as a white person, also male privilege in different respects, but you can also be disadvantaged as a privileged member of society. You can also have this disadvantage, and it's different for different people. And I think I had to sit down with one student especially, because he was really digging into it and having a hard time with it, and I was like, both are true. And it does feel really contradictory, and it's a weird place to just exist. It's a weird social location to have, but it's meaningful to really dig into that.
And that's why race is such an effective divide and conquer tool, right? Because it's like, oh, I don't have privilege. It's like, okay, you have a very specific kind of privilege that is actually holding you away from these other benefits. And so, seeing that one kind of privilege is counter to another one, and protects the elite in both ways. And I think a lot of race scholars, to my mind, racism is about elitism, right? It's ultimately about elitism. And if you erase class from racial analysis, then you just become this bougie racial analysis where, if people of color have the same healthcare opportunities and housing opportunities as white folks, then it's all good, without redressing this gross economic and wealth inequality that affects the whole country. And there's a big debate in the race scholarship kind of about this stuff, without really coming to a great approach to the intersection of race and class. I think we're still waiting for that unifying theory. There's tons of good stuff out there, but really, ultimately race and class are analyzed in very different ways, and so it's hard to really bring those together effectively. That and then you can start sounding like a conspiracy theorist, like, oh, they're using race to divide you, and it's like, well, yeah, they they are, but it's structured in how it is, and there's a great logic to it, right? I mean, it's racial rewards are way easier to give than class rewards. Like, oh, your job, your racial benefit is that you get to be a guard in a prison, right? Which is a horrible job, but it's, for white people, and they're literally, they're the slave patrol of back in the day. And the fact that we make money off of imprisoning people is just so crazy, right? That speaks to this rentier economy, where it's just like, okay, that's totally unproductive. In fact, it's anti-productive. I mean, maybe you have slave labor in the prisons, but really it's not a very productive labor. It's definitely not providing skills. And so then you sort of get these kind of white jobs that are handed out as a kind of patronage, right? Okay, you're a good steward of white supremacy here, so you get this lucrative job as a reward, even though you're probably one step from being incarcerated yourself. And so you just see this great reproduction. You have to admire how effective it is, right? From a sociological, stepping back, like, it endures and it gets reproduced. Like, 50 years ago, it wouldn't make sense to make money off of incarcerating people. It's clearly a drain on the economy, right? It's just like, no, that's totally unproductive. It's total drain. But now we've reshaped the economy in such a way that it's super helpful, and that you can just farm out. You can gain people's loyalty through giving them these sort of white privileged jobs.
Right. Which, maybe it makes you sound like a conspiracy theorist. I don't know. Is it a conspiracy theory if the conspiracy is historically correct at multiple junctures? Like, whether past or present, I think there are very many instances of the dynamics we're talking about being historical fact. And for me, that's been a powerful educational tool as well, right? I think what first helped open and free my mind to these ideas was when I first read A People's History of the United States in undergrad. And I'm very grateful that was assigned to me, because I just didn't know it existed before. And that's where I learned about the racial and class politics behind Bacon's Rebellion in the 1600s, right? Where you saw a lot of, the active construction by the ruling colonial elite of the time, descended from the British aristocracy, of how to manage the growing solidarity between the white settlers. But also they were demanding more stolen land. So it was really complicated. But those dynamics have historical roots. You lifted up your finger.
Well, I love Howard Zinn, love him to death. His telling of Bacon's Rebellion is kind of problematic in that way.
Okay.
Bacon himself was an elitist, unrequited racist. He was the. I've actually written about this, so I'm going to go a little bit in the weeds. But I think it's important to sort of, there's so much better examples of Europeans and indigenous populations and African populations living together in great conditions relative to that time and place. A lot of the Delaware Valley, you saw a lot of Finnish farmers living amongst indigenous populations. And so there was that solidarity until the elite arrived, right? And they're like, oh, we can't have this. This goes against God's will or whatever it is. And they,
Right.
these places and shot people. Bacon, though, Bacon was a cousin of the Governor Berkeley, who the rebellion was ostensibly against. And a lot
Sure.
of that, Bacon was rebelling against, we're attacking the allies of the colonies, the indigenous allies of the economy, and the Governor Berkeley was like, oh my gosh, this could be fatal to the colony because we depend on these alliances with these indigenous populations. And the fact that the indigenous people didn't turn on them really shifted the discourse of coloniality to a much more racial frame, not because of this alliance between Africans and Europeans in the colony with Bacon, but because now they could put everything on the indigenous population. So now with Bacon's rebellion, the natives were really constructed as the problem, and even though it was the elite who were monopolizing all of the land, the native people got constructed as that. At this time, all the up till the I'm sorry, I'm going in the weeds. Up till the 1800s, most subservient labor was white in the British North America, because they couldn't enslave they went to enslave the indigenous populations and they couldn't do it, and so they imported all these white folks as indentured servants. But most people didn't outlast the term of their indenture, right, which is like 5 to 7 years. Like 50% of the people died in indenture. And the problem arose to the colony when people started outliving that, and they had all these poor people who weren't white yet, who were just poor, subhuman, right? They were seen not as human as the elite were, who wanted, now, hey, we did our indenture, now you owe us land. And the elite were like, you're not getting land. There's no way. You can get land if you go into the wilderness and fight people and hack it out of the woods so we can appropriate it later. So then I think with Bacon's rebellion, it really shifted, like, oh, we can keep our monopolization, the elite monopolization of the land, by blaming it all on the indigenous folks. And Bacon made us realize that we're not as much at the mercy of the indigenous groups as we have been in the past, previously. And then you got, from that point on, just got all these horrible laws, return slave laws, and
Right.
just the upping up of the racism. Anyway, sorry.
So maybe I appreciate the clarification. It was helpful for my own education. And so maybe not the way Zid presented, but nevertheless, it's still an example of some of the race and class dynamics we're talking about.
For the sake of time, there's a question that I think actually might, it's meant to be after you talking about your article on conservatives embracing social democracy, but I think it actually works well with what you were just talking about your work on Bacon. How have your research findings, your writing, how do these things have implications for our current political moment, which is, as you were talking about Bacon and the elites and putting all the blame on the indigenous people, right? That sounds quite familiar to what we're experiencing right now, with the scapegoating of Latino, Latinx immigrants, and transgender people and people with disabilities. So can you talk a little bit about how have your findings of your past work, your writings, how can we think about those in our current political moment?
Yeah, I actually have a book chapter that I'm very fond of that I wrote that sort of goes from colonialism to Trump. So it's this, whirlwind. This is my problem with my writing, is I sprawl. So it's actually comparing the colonial history of Peru and British North America from 1532 until 2016. But in that sense, it's no accident that Trump is deploying these ICE agents and really creating this mystique around immigration and that immigrants are the problem. This is tried and true, and it has to be race first in a lot of ways. I admit that a lot of the anti-queer stuff, like the vehemence of that, has definitely caught me off guard for sure. But these Proud Boys that now are getting paid to be ICE agents, busting in and doing horrible things, it really is historically, since race's inception, North America in 17th and 18th century, race has really been what has propped up these, again, going back to the rentier, these rentier systems. If you can really find this group who has been constructed in such a way that they're isolated and seen as invaders, which included indigenous populations, probably still does, right? That they are infringing on us. Really works to prop up a lot of this elite layer that's really an aristocracy, right? So it really is setting up this aristocratic system, whereas capitalism and industrial production, it can be amenable to that, but it's also not necessarily so, right? In that capitalists are dependent on labor, right? You can't make a profit if you don't have workers. But aristocracy has a lot more flexibility, and a lot of aristocratic power is about marking people as disposable. Right? And yeah, we are inherently superior people. So we have the choice of life over death over people. And so this sort of willingness to just summarily execute people in the Caribbean, for example, or, turn Gaza into a beach resort or whatever, is functional for this system of governance. And I think sort of the turn we see, the traditional two-party system was troubled for a long time. It's hilarious to me in a tragic way that the Democrats, while all this horrible stuff is happening, the Democrats have zero ways to appeal to people, right? It's just like, oh, we're not Trump. It's like, okay, that has not worked for you. Have something that they can actually vote for rather than they can vote against. And it's not surprising at all because they're still beholden to their billionaire masters too, right? And I find Marx's analysis of politics very useful here, right? I mean, it is a committee of the bourgeoisie who's governing us, and our elections are our choice of which master we want to serve, and they're not serving our interests.
Right.
So I think sort of that collapse of that consensus around sort of technocratic rule fell apart because it wasn't serving people, and also the sort of technocratic bureaucracy was super alienating to people, and you see that in Trump's attacking that, right? Their whole rhetoric about the deep state. It troubles me so much how much they borrow this stuff from the left and then deploy it, right? Like a critique of the state, that's Marx, for God's sake, and they take it and they run with it and go horrible directions. And so it troubles me also when you see the left defending parts of the state, like the FBI. It's just like, okay, you shouldn't be doing that. I don't know if you should be celebrating this sort of unwinding of the FBI or whatever, but you certainly shouldn't be defending the FBI. So, you sort of see this loss of consensus around the way the governing was going, and Trump does stuff, right? He has accomplished huge amount of things, and he says he's going to do stuff, and he's accomplished it through authoritarian means for sure. But what did Obama achieve during his 8 years, right? What did Biden do? Why couldn't the Democrats pass a minimum wage, for God's sake, right? I mean, come on, the bar's low here. And, to borrow again from Marx, right, there's a specter haunting the Democratic Party, and that specter is socialism, and they're going to have to confront it one way or another. They're going to have to be, it's not like Mamdani is some radical dude, right? Europeans look at his policies and they're like, wow, that's really conservative, right? It's just like, oh, yeah. Even the right-wing parties in Germany and Italy don't want to get rid of their socialized medicine. It's like, oh yeah, we're going to adopt the American medical system. It's like, hell no, right?
Right.
They love their socialism. Like, oh, we got a train we can ride, and it's like you can complain about the train being late or whatever, but it's like, oh my god, I was going off on some tangent here, but anyway, but yeah, I do think it's the Democrats are going to have to face this specter one way or another, and honestly, so then we get back to my other work that we were paraphrasing this about, just like so. We interviewed 16 conservatives, self-described conservatives, and you feel people out, and we ended up asking them about these social democratic programs because that's the way the interview was going, and they're all like adamantly for something like single payer healthcare. Almost all of them. They're just like, oh, it's criminal we don't have a system like that. And they all wanted robust social democratic programs, and it was crazy. We had somebody come on to assist us, and these are all Zoom interviews, so you can do little messages on the side and like, what is happening here? And so it's really interesting. Why do these people call themselves Republicans? Which we ended up asking them. You mark yourself as conservative. What makes you say that? And a lot of it's identity, right? Like, oh, I could never call myself a Democrat. It's like, but we had one woman tell us like, oh, I am extremely conservative. I'm against socialism, and she called it socialism. I'm against socialism, but everybody has to go to the doctor, so I'm fine with socialism there. It's like, wow, you can't make this stuff up. So this whole discourse around polarization is so off. But a lot of it, have you heard of the book Hate Inc., Matt Taibbi? He sort of builds from Chomsky and Herman's notion of manufacturing consent. Chomsky and Herman sort of said, hey, they limit the discourse, what's civil to this very limited area, so you never talk about socialism, right? And Taibbi says, okay, now with the press being what it is, what makes money is this extremist views. So it's not just Fox News, it's, the New York Times, what are they covering? They're covering Trump, 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 right? Because that sells newspapers. And, again, Trump, not to give him too much credit, but in the 2020 election, he's like, well, the Washington Post wants me, the New York Times wants me to win because I'm selling newspapers. And he lost, and their sales went way down. So we see this broadcasting of this, oh, all these people are crazy, blah, 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 when in fact, these robust studies of people's opinions find that actually most people either agree on most issues or don't have any opinion at all, and this polarization is actually just reflected in elite interests and activists pushing these issues. But when we talk to liberals in our interviews, and we ask them, well, why don't we have single payer health care, universal health care, or family medical leave, or child care, just these basic humane things, and they're like, oh, because the other side is crazy, right? And we hear that all the time, right? Because it's really easy to be like, oh my God, because there are some crazies out there, but they're the ones profiled. Like Stephen Miller is a fringe person, right? Nick Fuentes, right? They're just, and all the focus on them, we never see these terms of actual agreement, and then these ways of making us divided get generated, and that we can just say, oh, they're using their lizard brain, right? It's like, no, they actually want the same things you want. We just don't have a way of bringing ourselves together. And I'm sure, once you drill down into the particulars, I'm sure there'll be fights about that, like trans stuff. Like these Republicans were really hung up on trans stuff. It's just like, oh my God, do some research. And they're also all working too much, so nobody's informed, long hours and exhaustion and everything else. So that's kind of lost. But I sort of see this huge opportunity of really being able to bring folks together, and just sort of realizing what mechanisms are driving us apart. And it's really easy to be cynical, and to my mind, I think that kind of fatalism is more of a privilege Michelle had asked me about one of my favorite topics. Actually, it was one of the last questions there, which is, my telling people to imagine the impossible. You have to imagine the impossible every day. And, this isn't just me saying this. This is a Black feminist thought. They're like, you have to imagine an alternative that comes out of what we have now. And to not do it, you're perpetuating what's going on. And that kind of fatalistic cynicism is a privilege. But I think it's really easy to see that the impossible happens all the time. Like, our reality today is so different than anybody could have imagined. 20 years ago, if you had said Donald Trump is going to be president, people would have laughed you out of the room, right? Nobody imagined that craziness. And yet, here we are. And there's positive examples of this too, where you can't imagine a lot of stuff going on. Second wave feminism, for all its problems, right? It transformed institutions, right? You see a lot more women, and not even just elite women, in a lot more places, that it's a direct result of second wave feminism. And that, it's a victim of its own success in a lot of ways, but it really transformed schools and places of work into things that we couldn't have imagined before. And the same is with, the civil rights movement. For its shortcomings, I guess MLK had a dream and we realized it somehow, and now it's all fixed. Except now they're even saying that, now all these right-wing people are saying that the Civil Rights Act was a real problem and we should repeal it, even though the Supreme Court has been repealing it little by little anyway, with Roberts being preeminent among there. So hegemony is so powerful.
Hegemony being what we as a society consider normal, that serves the interests of the relatively few who hold the most power in our social world, as Scarritt speaks to. Hegemonic are the things we buy into or go along with because that's just the way it is.
We're being screwed, and we have to sort of rationalize ourselves being screwed, and that's what everybody's trained to do. So you're like, oh no, I'm not screwed. There's a reason things are the way they are. And so we rationalize this stuff, and there's a reason for it rather than us being screwed, because we have to live our life. And so I think instead of seeing this as a normal, non-strange way of being, we need to see our daily existence as crazy and go from there. We, in the kind of research I was doing with Michelle, we ask students all the time, how would your life be different if college was free? And you get people tying themselves in knots, justifying why they are paying tuition and how paying tuition is beneficial to them, when it's just extracting their future earnings that they don't even have yet, right? It's just extraction. And so it's really interesting unpeeling that hegemonic type of thinking. Like, we have people saying like, well, thank goodness I was injured when I was deployed, because that allows me to have disability to pay for higher education. And it's like, thank goodness you are disabled from the army. It's like, it's crazy, right? But that is the logic we're thinking of. And luckily, peeling back the top layer isn't that hard. It's all there. You're not going to change people's minds, but it's at least good to sort of reveal the logic through which people justify the status quo.
I liked how you conceptualized hegemony as not being able to imagine alternatives. I feel like that's kind of like a simple way of demonstrating the concept and also the lived reality of it. That's something in our last episode, that's something that we talked about, of just like the concept of hegemony and how to explain it all.
I have a little exercise I love doing, revealing this, and I just have people guess the demographic breakdown of the United States population by race, and just say, guess, what's the black population of the United States, what's the white population, what's the Hispanic population, what's the indigenous population by percentage. And I know what they're going to do. Sometimes I write it down. I was like, okay, you're going to get this wrong, and not only are you going to get it wrong, I know which direction you're going to get it wrong. You're going to overestimate the black population, dramatically underestimate the white population, overestimate the Hispanic population. And so that sort of reveals like, oh, what we think we know is not actually the truth here, and that there's other things that are shaping our sense of the world that is very misguided. So it's a fun little interactive exercise.
I love that. Yeah, and something too that I've been this semester in particular thinking more and more about is the power of associations, because I will ask, and this is something I kind of do with every lecture, and maybe it's because of like my background, but I find myself first asking students about their associations to all of these different concepts that I'll bring up, and usually they're ones that they've like heard tangentially, but they don't really know about whatever they may be. And so I ask them these things, and then I give them like a definition of it and show how it can be used in these different ways. And it had they never been confronted those associations, they would have never learned. And I feel like it's a fortunate position to be in, but not a lot of people are in that position to reflect on how they associate different things with different things, and then learning what is actuality. And even in just like daily conversation or the major things that are going on in the world, is like association has and connotation has more impact than denotation does, like beyond maybe even academia, in academia still, but beyond academia or learning spaces. I feel like those associations win out a lot of times with it's just like what we think it is or what it makes us feel, and that is going to then determine how we interact with that concept or other people related to it and all of that. I feel like maybe we have time for another question. You mentioned a bit about policy that bars you from talking about things, and so talk about just how recent attacks on DEI efforts on university campuses have played out, and how you, as a rather progressive thinker, working in a very conservative part of the country, how has all of that been? What is your take? What do you want to express about it?
Yeah, I think there was a previous bill to this too that was more toothless, less toothful. And really, it was a big scare tactic. And I was chair during that time. And, all my faculty were freaked out. And they're like, can I teach this book? Can I do whatever? And even though I would say, this is not affecting you, don't, basically that law was you can't indoctrinate people. It's like, well, good. I'm not interested in doing that, so no problem. But, it really was, they had freedom of information calls for everybody's syllabi, and you had to show these, and we have this organization called the Idaho Freedom Foundation, which is all not freedom, who was really intimidating, and they got Koch money, and really just making contingent laborers feel their contingency and their precarity, and really trying to hew that way. And now this next one, though, has really got people a lot more freaked out. I've sort of already addressed one approach I was trying to take, and we'll still, I feel a head-on approach is good rather than cowering in the shadows. It's disconcerting when you do see faculty get fired for teaching pretty mainstream race stuff. There's a woman in Indiana who was just fired. I just cannot believe they're going to have a case with her, but it's still traumatic, right? The whole going through all that process is trauma. And so my immediate reaction is like, this is a bunch of bullshit, and I'm not going to. But I'm super privileged in that, and I'm super privileged because I also teach mostly soc majors, and you know what IMSORL's like. We start at a point where most people don't even get to, right? Of just like, yeah, we're steeped in inequality and oppression. Go from there, right? And figure it out. And the students who are drawn to it love it. They're like, oh, thank God we can talk about this stuff this way. So, I'm not teaching these lower division courses that are really designed to be the ones where our law is written that students can bring claims right to the Attorney General, who's a wannabe fascist. And so I think people fear it a little bit, but it's really activists who do that stuff, and we definitely have pretty active right-wing folks here. But I haven't seen that personally play out. I really think that the university is playing defense totally on this one. And previously, the university had a strategy of kind of distracting, like okay, you have this law, but focus on, look at our innovation, right? Really sort of playing the capitalist productivity, you need us card. And now they're just in full-on retreat mode. Our president and provost moved on, so now we have interim people. And I think looking at what happened to Texas, University of Texas Austin is known as this bastion of free thinking, right? And they put this real right-wing guy in charge of it as provost, I think. And I certainly fear that that's what they want for Boise State, right, to really put this person in. And my colleague, who had been in the last hire of the last president, said, oh yeah, they're really trying to get somebody in there like that, but nobody will take it for the poor salary that it has, right? So these right-wing people are used to getting $500,000 salaries plus or whatever, so the $250,000 salary or whatever it is for the president, 400, is peanuts for them. And so, I've been pleasantly surprised that our last president was actually pretty progressively minded and didn't take these issues head on. But we founded the Anti-Racism Collective under her leadership. When she was called in front of Congress, as she is every year, instead of the Idaho legislature, they questioned her on it, like, what is this Anti-Racism Collective? This is not the stuff we want there. And, to my mind, she was like, well, okay, good. Thank you for the invitation for me to explain to you about ongoing racism here, right? She didn't do that, which I thought was a great opportunity since they're asking about it. And we have a DEI certificate too. And a lot of this is just kind of being thorns in their sides because we don't have much institutional weight behind it. But the DEI certificate we've had for 3 years, and the university has never, ever put it in the course catalog.
Interesting.
Yeah, so they're undermining us at every step, it sort of feels like. Yeah, I think diversity, and we'll be testing this, we'll be doing interviews about diversity again. Like when we interview students about diversity, it's this real happy talk and like, oh, diversity's great, diversity's everywhere. And so it is sort of interesting, like, hey, with this sort of anti-diversity discourse going on now, how much is that going to change? I'm assuming it's not going to change much. I'm sort of thinking this anti-DEI stuff is these extremists trying to push, you've heard the Overton window discourse where you can change the scope of the discourse if you say these extremist things. I'm curious to see if the students' embracing of diversity, in these really non-critical ways has changed, right? This sort of pro-diversity stance, diversity is great, diversity is everywhere. If now they'll be like, oh no, diversity is harmful, which I kind of don't think I'll see. But really the whole notion that school is about jobs training will probably feed into that. Like, well, what do I need that for my job? And DEI efforts were trying to make that vocational case. Of course you need to understand diversity in the job place, but in our racist society, you really don't. Right? I mean, it'd be good if you had some real critical awareness of different forms of inequality and oppression, but I think a lot of that DEI stuff was not really ever teaching that. And, studies of businesses and their implementation of diversity policies, it was ill-defined. It was just performative spouting off at best. And we're like, okay, well, what is diversity then? And they're like, I don't know. So, well, we have a policy and we're supposed to be doing that. It is definitely more oppressive now. There's no doubt. I wish we'll definitely push back more. We'll have another panel. We'll have to consult with the lawyers to have a panel now, which is disgusting. But I do think it's a case of playing the cards you have. So, yeah, it's oppressive, but also historically, it's not like the U.S. has ever been an enlightened utopia of humanistic, hey, everybody gets to pursue their own interests and be happy kind of place. So, honestly, I see lots of great possibility with what's going on. I don't mean to be Pollyanna here. I'm not saying it's inevitable, but in a lot of ways, there are devout right-wing Maoists who are driving a lot of these policies, and they're deliberately pulling down our institutions. And, our healthcare system before all this stuff happened was terrible. right? It's horrible. And, that Obamacare was seen as a solution when, 25 million people still went without health care. Medical bankruptcies were horrible for people with health care. Our health care outcomes were terrible. And so again, back to this specter of socialism, it's like, well, we've torn down this. Now there's hardly a healthcare system existing now. Let's rebuild something better. And we don't have to look at the specter of the Soviet Union anymore, of how horrible socialism is. We can look at Denmark and say, oh dear, heaven forbid we have a Danish-style healthcare system here. And I see that with a lot of identification with Europe. It's like, well, what's the problem with socialism? Like, sure, there's problems therein, but you're comparing apples and oranges when you look at their healthcare systems to ours. I mean, I've seen some studies where it's like, if the U.S. had the French healthcare system, 400,000 people less would die every year. It's a human right. It's crazy, right? I mean, our reality is crazy. So I do sort of see this massive swing to the right that's mostly disruptive, right? It's a big protest vote because the two parties were locked into this horrible agreement and going nowhere, and rich were getting richer underneath that too. And so now there's a great possibility that we can radically remake our society in very human first ways. And it's not like we have to reinvent anything, right? It's all, we can just borrow freely from people and there'll still be problems. I mean, there's definitely still going to be problems. Nothing's going to be a silver bullet, but making something better and then going from there is certainly a way forward. I mean, FDR back in the day thought we were going to have socialized medicine. That was inevitable. And so he compromised with Medicaid. Why would we have a system that denies people health coverage? It's inhumane, right? It doesn't make any sense. But now, again, power of hegemony, it makes sense to a lot of people. So I think everybody's going to be hit. The middle class and the upper middle class are going to be hit heavily by a lot of this healthcare transformation, and they're going to have a lot of pushback. And a lot of people don't buy this stuff, but I certainly see it as a possible route forward. And, I think back to even the Occupy movement was a worldwide movement, but I think there's some effective criticism in saying, like, it was a protest against everything, which everything needed to be protested, and as a protest against inequality. I think if they could have focused in the United States on the issue of housing or healthcare, like, let's just make healthcare and housing a human right, have this issue, and we're not a single issue thing, but that can concentrate our energy on getting these issues forward, and we might alienate some of the people that are part of the group, but that's fine. Then we can go forward. And honestly, there's been some really cool means going on. When Florida voted for Trump in 2020, they passed a $15 minimum wage by flying colors. The Democratic Party was in disarray, but this other group would come in there and pass this $15 minimum wage by like almost 70% approval rate. Right. And the stupid Democratic Party of Florida distanced themselves from that. It's like, no, that is the horse you need to be riding, for God's sake. So you're seeing all these much more popular-based ways that are not party-affiliated, but based on mutual humanity of, hey, do you think women should die during childbirth? Like, oh, no, okay, well then, here's something easy we can do about it. Sign this petition and vote for this issue. And, Idaho had a citizen initiative for Medicaid expansion, which passed 67% in this highly conservative state because it's a fundamental issue of just plain human decency. And people are that way. We can look at the Fuentes of the world, Nick Fuentes, and say like, oh, they love being cruel, but that's not who most of the people are. And so there's an infrastructure for making change this way at a local level that does go up. And there's a lot of power in that movement. When these citizens initiatives passed, Idaho government started trying to make citizens initiatives harder and harder to pass. It's guaranteed in the Constitution, but that doesn't mean that they can't change the rules to make it harder and harder. And you see that a lot of places now. You need supermajorities to pass this. You need signatures from every block into the state. They create all these mechanisms to stop this much more robust form of democracy from happening. But I think there's ways there. I think there's issues. I do think higher education should be free. There's tons of reasons why that's the case. And there's studies that say, hey, if California were to make college free for everybody, the median tax increase would be $65 a year. And people would be happy paying that. I mean, it's a progressive tax, and rich people would have to pay a lot more. And Gavin Newsom is so incompetent that he can't champion that, right? He should just be like, oh my God, this will actually make us money. If we remake public education public, there'll actually be this huge saving of money. Only a third of the money that's paid to education actually goes to education. The rest of it goes to financing debt. And so if Newsom did that, that's one of the largest economies in the world. All the rest of the country would be hugely impacted by that, and Newsom, they could then take the mantle of like this champion of the people, but there's no way he wants to do that because that would bite him in the ass on the president, or so they think, right? I still think socialism is a selling subject for Democrats. DNC will never come around to that, but Mamdani, he won by flying colors against massive amounts of money pitched against him, and his policies are not crazy. It's like free buses. Like, it's actually you'd probably save tons of money not collecting fares for buses, right? That whole infrastructure just goes away. People want it. Like, it's not like if you give free medicine, people are going to be like wanting to go to the doctor all the time. People hate going to the doctor and being poked and prodded, right? Yeah, there's going to be some abuse, but my God, the system is sort of set up to legalize abuse. Like, look at these CEOs of these insurance companies just making tons of money denying people health care.
Thinking about my students and the way they think about capitalism in class coming into my classes compared to when I was an undergrad, it's a sea change in terms of, and of course there's going to be some selection bias of the sociologists I'm teaching, of course, right? But I don't know, I was not surprised by the findings in your article. I feel like it is shocking, right? But I think it really does reflect this change in mass consciousness in a progressive direction, that Democrats trying to like stonewall it and manage expectations on one hand, establishment Democrats versus the fascist response, the MAGA movement, and Trump on the other hand of trying to validate some of these concerns and then provide a white supremacist scapegoating answer to them and an authoritarian power, right? All of those seem to be aimed at trying to head off this growing kind of class consciousness and movement. This is my own tangent. But I think there is real hope in the moment as well. And there is always hope to be found in the possibility of progressive change. It's always there. And the seeds of it are always happening.
I love hearing that. That's great. I think socialism isn't a bad word as it used to be, right?
Nope.
Especially for younger demographics. So, and even going to those silly No Kings rallies, which were awesome, show of power, but it's like, can't we have a higher threshold than No Kings? It was, it just seemed like, oh yeah, we're just going to go to that. Like, it was like no big deal. It's like, okay, great. Let's see this sort of mass mobilization show of power, and let's focus it on some real humane things that I think are not off of the scale of what people are thinking about. So I'm really encouraged to hear your students sort of seeing things very differently.
Wayne, do you have any final thoughts?
I just, the only thing that kept on rattling in my head was that teaching empathy is not indoctrination. And in California and Oregon, like Intro to Sociology has been used as a gen ed tool to talk about intersectionality, to talk about empathy and different experiences for all kinds. Yeah, right. It is the DEI initiative, essentially, of like trying to teach different perspectives. And so, I mean, that's part of why sociology has been attacked in a lot of states as well as a discipline. Even though really at its core, sociology is quite conservative. But yeah, I just kept on thinking about like how, in my mind, sociology, talking about these different experiences, the social democracy of healthcare, these things, it's like, it's about building empathy, but that's what is scary to the elites.
Yeah, I mean, you would think empathy is kind of the definition of being human, right? Now there's these right-wing provocateurs who are against empathy. And I mean, there's critiques you can make of empathy that are valid, but I think being able to understand other people, but critical understanding is important, and definitions of empathy without sort of a critical understanding can be problematic. But, there's all these crazy right-wing guys who are just, most of them are guys, who are just like, oh yeah, empathy's bad, can't have empathy. And I can't believe that's getting any traction. I think it's just extremists, but it sort of shows the moment of what we've been reduced to, of when they're sort of attacking this thing that, I'm sure most everybody agrees that empathy is a positive thing that everybody needs to have and is helpful to everybody and good for everybody in our lives and for everybody around us. And we lack it. We lack the ability to really understand other people and engage with them, and it'll be interesting to see if we can increase that infrastructure, right, for active critical empathy.
What we've been talking around, we've talked about different ways in which people are dehumanized and how then inequality can topple them. Stigma makes dehumanization a thing where then we justify our harmful behaviors or the harm that is done onto certain people disproportionately because we've effectively dehumanized them, whether it's racial inequalities or minoritized people or criminals. Once we've labeled someone a criminal, we can easily dehumanize them, lock them up, throw away the key, we don't care what's happening to them. Right, so then teaching empathy thwarts that. If we're really pushing empathy and having people critically understand other people's perspectives and experiences and stuff like that, it makes sense that they're targeting empathy to be able to continue the efforts of dehumanization. But then, as something I mentioned earlier, but then as I've been writing notes down throughout our conversation, we talked about identity being the most kind of powerful factor in why people say that they're conservative, why people say that they're liberal or whatever it is. And it's not really about the politics of it. It is more in the identity of it, and there's so much power in identity and affiliation and association. And I wonder if it is the driving force behind all of that, and why all of those things are so powerful is because of alienation. We are living in an entirely alienated culture, and so many people, they don't have their perspectives and experiences challenged because they're not in community with different types of people, if they're in community with anyone at all. And so it's an enduring question, one that I think maybe all of us are trying to push in our own ways. How do we combat alienation so that identity, affiliation, association, and dehumanization aren't so powerful? How do we undermine their stronghold? Something that I feel we keep coming back to in our conversations with the different guests that we've had on, the idea of shared humanity. People who even call themselves conservatives being for socialized medicine is because they recognize that aspect of humanity. We all go to the doctor. We are mortal. We have to engage in these different programs. And so, making it accessible for more people. And something, too, that was rattling around in my brain as we've been talking is that, these systems that are set in place while they have been so enduring, we're seeing them start to crumble because their foundations were so problematic that, they're causing a lot of harm in the meantime while they are slowly crumbling. But what we're seeing now, I think, is more of the crumbling. And I think a lot of these things, maybe they're going to burn themselves down eventually. And then that's when we'll see more progressive and positive changes that do center our shared humanity more.
I hope so. Or we'll see, another fascist regime. But because I think there's a lot of people working towards making us more humane, and there's a lot of ways to do it. And I think there's now, in our least humane moment, there's more possibilities to do it, too. That sort of our inhumanity is being revealed more. It's funny, Michelle, you talk about alienation. I actually, to toot my own horn here, the university didn't have anybody else better to recommend, but they nominated me for this Carnegie Fellowship on political polarization, and basically that's what I'm talking about. If we're so polarized, why do we agree on these things? And it's really alienation. So I propose to study different forms of alienation and try to get at that and unwind it a little bit.
Which is the importance of your findings in that context piece, that even though they're calling themselves conservatives, they're not really living by conservative ideals, is that it offers a counter narrative to what we're really seeing of, while there is validity and there is a lot of when we're voting and the way that the structure is set up, there is a lot of polarization, but there's also what we see in the media. Come off our phones, we stop really engaging with that as much, and we start engaging with just people around us. We'll see that a lot of times that's not our actual lived reality, which can be very good on the psyche when you're trying to live like day by day, because it's so easy to get wrapped up. I mean, the sensationalism of it all, and how you were talking about how like Trump sells so much news and newspapers and articles and stuff like that, and we live in a time where sensationalism is very gripping, and my partner calls it like these gotcha moments. Like there's a lot of people who a lot of their logic is just oriented around like the gotcha.
Yeah. And I know a lot of those too, again, they sell, right? I mean, Facebook, it was revealed that they know that if you stir hate, you make more money. And, then that's the problem with our media these days. It is just like unhinged in its profit-driven rationality, in that I think something like 50% of the population gets their news from Facebook and Google, which have disavowed any journalistic credibility. They're like, no, that's not what we do. It's like, no, it is what you do. It is what you're doing. This is where people get their information. And liberals are as guilty of this as much too, right? The sort of the glee at, people who are anti-vaccines dying from COVID or whatever, right? And that kind of parallel processes of dehumanization, that gotcha, as you say, and I get why people do the gotcha. It's like, well, you perpetuated this and imposed it on a lot of other people because you're a person of power, but still reveling in somebody's death is not great.
I really enjoyed this conversation. I every time we have a new episode, I'm walk away energized because of being able to nerd out about these concepts and ideas, learning new things, learning, new scholarship. Thank you for coming on as a guest, Arthur.
Well, thanks for doing the podcast thing all together, and thanks for having me on it. This is fun conversation, so I really appreciate all that you do.
Thank you, Arthur. Thanks for joining us. It's been a really great time to have you on here.
I echo what Wynn was saying. It is very nice to be able to essentially nerd out and talk about these things, and it's something that, because I've been feeling very jaded with academia, it's something that is a nice reprieve and a motivator to continue. But also, I also wrote down how you said that higher education can be a tool of empowerment, and I think that's what I found it to be. Then like getting through and I guess achieving the highest level of it, and now just like looking around, it can be very disillusioning. But having these conversations and reminding myself even that there are people who actually do have these more humanistic perspectives.
Well,
yeah, thank you so much, Scarritt.
Yeah.
You're still not Arthur.
Yeah, Jeff still calls me Scarritt too. And
I bet he does.
I see him every day. He even calls me Dr. Scarritt frequently. It's like, oh God.
I know, it's so funny too, because I don't have, now that I have that title too, like I still will opt for Michelle and the more informal, but there's something, the association will say, the power of association, you'll always be Scarritt.
I'm sorry. Well, thanks so much. I really had a great time.
Likewise. Thank you.
Absolutely, yes, thank you.
Great seeing you.
Likewise. Thank you.
Thank you
for listening.
That was the best one yet.
Yeah. Real strong.